Good morning, scientists. Good morning, policymakers. After two heavyweight presentations, there's really not much left for me to say. So instead of talking, I just want to ask questions in the next 10 minutes. The first question is, can scientists and policymakers work together? Yes? Anyone? I see some yeses. No? Some no's. Or we just don't care. Anyone? This is a complex question. There's no definite yes or no answers. So those who answered to the first two questions, they are both correct. The fact that we all care, the third question, means that we have hope. There are barriers and challenges, but if both sides are willing to collaborate and we all work together, there's a way. I want to state the problem in a very simple way. Evidence-based policy. In theory, it should work. The scientists and researchers produce scientific evidence, sound and strong, and feed them into the policy-making process, and policymakers will use them and provide guidance and feedback and especially funding for the scientists to do research. So that's a good collaboration. So at the end, we see evidence policy with a double arrow. So that's the ideal way of bringing the two worlds together. But of course, you see, the double arrow is not a straightforward black arrow. It is colorful. The bridge between scientists and policymakers could be colorful in languages, in content, in the interaction, personal communications, could be colorful. There could be rough edges. You see the triangles, the squares. So it is not easy. Why is it not easy? This is a cartoon. Someone is speaking to a bartender. My policymaker doesn't understand me in a very sad way. So you guess who this client is? A researcher. When you see this cartoon, you can imagine that there is a similar but opposite cartoon on the other side. Maybe on this screen, on the other side of the podium, with a policymaker speaking to a bartender as well. And he or she would say, my scientist doesn't understand me. So that's one big problem. A few years ago, I was talking to a very senior manager within the Public Health Agency, in fact, a policymaker, a director general. I was explaining to him how science is becoming so complex with the high-power statistics that we need to simplify it so that the policymakers can understand. That's the knowledge transfer. And he said, Bernard, you are totally wrong. You do not get the point. It is not the science that's so complex for the policymakers to understand. It is the other way around. You scientists are so simple-minded that you don't understand the complex policy world. I thought, wow, this is something new. I haven't heard about this before. And so we talk and talk. We talk about 6 ways to improve the communication, to bridge the gap. We talk about one-page policy briefs for the policymakers. We also talked about one-page science briefs from the policymakers to enlighten the scientists. Finally, we published a journal paper. So that's the kind of thing that we need to promote. Why are scientists and policymakers different? Why do they not understand each other? The target. In the scientific world, we always talk about publishing or perishing. Publications, the 3 Ps, patents and professorships are important. For the policymakers, they do not need to publish any papers in scientific journals to advance their career. They talk about good policy, good practice, and how to link with people. So they all have the different 3 Ps. The language they use is different. For the scientists, for some unknown reasons that we still need to do some research on, we use a lot of alpha error, beta coefficients, kappa statistic. If there's no Greek letters in our language, it doesn't seem right. And we need a lot of mathematical symbols as well. So that's the scientific language. For the policymakers, they talk in terms of acronyms. And of course, acronyms means a lot of things, and you sometimes ask them for a definition. And they will define the acronym by further acronyms. But they understand acronyms within the policy world, so that's fine. But the scientists would not be able to understand. The time perception. In science, the longer the research project, the better quality it is. That's a common belief. If the research can be done in 3 months' time, no, it's no good. It has to be a clinical trial. It has to be a cohort study of 20,000 people over 20 years, then it is a good study. But for the policymakers, their time frame is so much different. The answers are always needed instantly. Yesterday, that would be better. Last week, it would be even better. They want it instantly. The career path, scientists spend their entire research career in one narrow area. They tend to dig a deep hole into the ground, narrow and deep, so that no one else from the outside can compete with them. I am the world expert on this small area. So in that sense, they are learning more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. For the policymakers, they tend to move on quickly from one project to another to gain a wide spectrum of experience. We have 2 jokes here. For the scientists, the way to live forever is to find a research question so important that one cannot die without finding the answer. Then never work on it. You won't die. For the policymakers, I have made up my mind. Don't confuse me with the facts. There are success stories of science and policymakers working together, such as the use of knowledge brokerage, knowledge brokers to go in between, like the work of the bartender talking to the scientists and the policymakers and try to communicate with them. Doing science within the government is another way. We have a lot of research scientists within the federal government. They are doing good work, and these work, unlike the university kind of research, are more tailored to policy needs and the requirements. A lot of the granting agencies are now requiring a dissemination strategy for the researchers to address so that their results of the projects will be used or disseminated to those who need to know. One-page policy briefs is another thing that would be useful. Here, we see someone sitting there and someone else holding 3 big binders, volumes of research findings. Can you come back with that 3-year study summarized in 6 bullet points in PowerPoint? So this is the kind of things we need to do. We come up with a 3-volume research finding. We also need to be able to produce the results in simple language. This is a table that summarizes the work of INVA a few years ago on the ways to bridge the gap between policy makers and science. And they look at 24 interview studies and found that facilitators include things like personal contact between scientists and policymakers. Personal contact, they actually know each other. That's a big facilitator. Timeliness, research summary, and so on. And of course, the opposite of these are the barriers to the use of research. So I have a number of questions just to start the thinking process and to facilitate our subsequent roundtable discussion. Should there be incentives for scientists or policymakers if they take initiative to build a dialogue? Currently, there's no requirement for the two groups to communicate. We need to have some incentives to make that happen. Should there be knowledge brokers, and how can they go between the scientists and policymakers? Should there be organizational capacity building interventions? The institution, the organization should be able to do something about it. For example, within the federal government, we actually have a training course for the scientists to become leaders offered by the Canada School of Public Service. Should research be defined far more broadly than the biomedical community conventional beliefs? The conventional belief is that we have a risk factor, we have a disease, a one-to-one, and we try to do that. But now this disease process is so complex, and it also involves other things like social determinants, like health inequity. And so we need to expand our thinking about what actually research should be defined. Should the knowledge transfer starting point be redefined? Right now, it is on the researchers. The researchers think of a project and they do the research. But maybe we should have some feedback from the policymakers, especially, and also the community input from the general population on which research should be done and which should be delayed. Should the accountability to peer-reviewed journal editors extended to policymakers? Scientists, they publish papers in scientific journals. Policymakers, they have accumulated a lot of experiences, but they never publish it in the scientific journals. Maybe that should be done as well. Should it be recognized that scientists and policymakers are not equal partners, and therefore additional work must be done? Scientists are usually considered wise people, and the policymakers are considered powerful people. And how do we make them on equal ground? And finally, should it be acknowledged that it is too simplistic to think that policy making could ever be purely or perhaps even largely based on scientific evidence? Not all policies, or even good policies, need scientific evidence. Intuition can be useful for deriving some of these good policies. So these are the 8 questions that I pose for us to consider, and hopefully with the further work on this and collaboration, we'll get this resolved and push forward in terms of integrating science and policy. Thank you.